got this half-hour period now for, you know, probably, if not the most important reason that we're here for all of us in the room is to allow the folks who live there to tell us directly what's going on, what keeps you up at night, what is it about channel migration zones that directly affect your perspective on being there and based on whatever the role is that you have. So um, we're going to start with Don. We can see if that microphone is working.
Dust?
Yeah. So I've asked each one of them to prepare a very succinct, kind of an overarching statement of what their one or two, main issues or concerns are, the challenges that they're dealing with from where they've come from. Don is a former president of the Timberline Rim Board, the Homeowners Association Board, and we've worked very closely since the flood with them on a lot of issues there, and they've been a great host and convener, or co-convener for the work that we've done at a public level. So we'll let Don and each one of them have about 5 minutes to quickly first tell us the issue, and then I would like to just really open the room up while he's just spoke, and let's just give me some feedback. I want to hear how do you react to that? What does that mean to you? Is that salient? Do you have a question that we need to clarify? Because we want to take those issues and directly bring them to the panel when we get back from the break and talk about how they apply to the Silver Jackets and the Oregon Solutions opportunity. So go ahead, Don.
Again, I'm Don Shea. I would first like to thank you all for inviting me to be here. Um, this room represents one of the greatest assets that Timberline Rim gets out of this, because we could never marshal this kind of expertise, never. And I want to thank you all for including us in this process and listening to our concerns and for bringing your expertise to the table to help us to deal with the issues, the very real issues that we face on a daily basis. Um, we've worked very closely with the county, with Jay, with Steve Weiss, with the council on projects, with many meetings trying to understand the study that was undertaken by Dr. Tim Abbey has been a great asset to us in helping us to understand the dynamic of exactly what we're facing and how best to address that through our decision-making process. So I greatly appreciate it, and I applaud you all for your efforts. I truly do. Um, we joined with the council on a project for a stream opening and floodplain reconnection project, which we just had an event that rivaled, I believe, the 2011 event. It may not have been exactly that great, but it was significant. You can tell by the flow rates at the different metering points. You can tell by the walking the ground up there and seeing the height that the water went to. I can tell you that in the past, the river gauge at, I believe it's Bull Run, is one of the most accurate gauges as long as you understand how to translate that level to the specific point you're looking at on the river. And it was at, I think last Sunday, it was at 18.48 feet. And normally we get overbanking in Division 5 and along the banks of the other divisions in about 14.3 is when we get overbanking. And we start getting significant erosion when it exceeds 16 feet down there. We get significant bank erosion. And this time, as I said, it was 18.48. And at Brightwood Bridge, it was over 6, and flood is 6. And I digress for a moment. At Bull Run, flood is, I believe, 19.3 or 19.4 is full flood. And so we were right at that level, very similar to what it was in 2011. And yet we did not incur the kind of damages that we normally would. I attribute much of that to the work of the council and the side stream opening, and all of the other partners that joined in that, the county, many others who joined in that project. I believe OWEB was involved in it. There are a number of funding agencies that were involved in it. That side stream opening, Jay made a point earlier where he said that the river reaches a threshold. And when it reaches that point, then the bank disappears. And we actually reached that point in flow. However, the side stream opening and the floodplain reconnection project that we were engaged in um, allowed the river to remain below that threshold, where it slowed the river down just enough. It retained the water just long enough to give us that brief respite that we need from the flow in order to get past the event. And it did succeed at that, in my estimation. I've lived in Timberline Rim since 1992. I lived through the 96 flood, the 2006, the 2009, the 2011. I've been there, I've lived it. And I have a pretty good feel for the flow rates and the damages that result from them. I walked the land up there at the Columbia Land Trust property and looked at the flow by the height of the sediment lines on the rocks and on the bushes, on the everything. It had covered the island up there. Had we had that flow without that side stream being open, we would have lost considerable land. We may well have lost our water crossing to Division 5, which goes under the river and now is within 5 feet of being exposed. Those kinds of projects are the kinds of projects that I would like to see continued and expanded on upstream from Timberline Rim, because that offers us the greatest amount of relief, I believe.
Well, I just want to quickly have a clarification too for Don, because you've been very direct over the last few years in advocating for some type of project or work, because there's a water line and a wastewater line crossing that are in the rim there that serves both sides. And they had those reinstalled a number of years ago because the place where they were making landfall going under the river had encroached on them, so they had a setback. And then in 2011, the river actively migrated right into that area and is just about to re-expose those pipes again at enormous cost. $450,000. And so they've had an ongoing, concern and question as, this threatens the very viability of being able to have habitability there for them if they lose wastewater. And how would you address that? So that for them, this is a huge aspect here about the community planning piece, is thinking about the exposure they have for their wastewater, and how would that fit into a future project or a planning priority for us? Anybody want to comment on that really quickly before we go to Murph? I'll just say quickly, the permitting, the water quality issues, all of the issues about working with infrastructure in the river up there there's a high criticality to how it's done, which adds a lot of expense and delays as well. So the impacts from having to make those kinds of investments are not small. Chris?
I appreciate what Don said about looking for upstream opportunities, and I think the opportunity there is to make our project area big enough that we can consider those upstream relief areas, or even it doesn't necessarily have to be upstream, but so that's the opportunity, is to keep the planning area large enough.
Yes, thank you. Christine Shirley is the state floodplain manager, works for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Murph, you're up.
Thank you, Chris, for that. I'd like to state, Don and I have been involved with this from the very beginning of January 16th, 2011, standing on the banks, watching our neighborhood wash away, wondering when the Army Corps of Engineers were going to come in and put a jetty to protect our homes. Little did we know what the process was. It's been a journey. So instead of doing a post-mortem study, we're now doing pre-mortem study, and pre-mortem being upstream work before water comes and takes us away. I did prepare a statement, as Jay had asked. I'll try and get this out. This was done late last night. The concern I find most important is to establish a template or plan that each project is designed, permitted, and built is within the river's reach is in mind, and not just the concern of a single property. The Upper Sandy could end up with a collage of revetments, work against each other instead of in unison, and cause more damage and blame than good. The Sandy River is an endangered species habitat for 4 endangered species, puts the species survival first in the design of any project, which is a plus. It forces the use of wood materials, native plants, and projects designs lean away from the rock projects. These type of engineering forces the use of abandoned wetlands. In the case of my neighborhood, is what our housing development is. The process we have made since the 2011 event includes a professional analysis of the upper Sandy River, which details limited protection of the timberline rim area and calls for multiple property buyouts to create a neighborhood that can survive intense storm frequency by opening traditional waterways that have been closed off by levees built during the re-engineering of the river in 1965 and steering water with engineered log jams into these waterways relieves the intense energy and slows down the flow through the reach. This process is less destructive and reestablishes the rich salmon habitat that at one time was responsible for the top salmon producing stream in the lower Columbia. And that, my point being that if we lean toward the natural process of this river, it's absorbing its energy and the water is being absorbed in the ground, slowing it down just those few seconds we need before it does its destructive force, takes out what we decided to build on. That ground is extremely vulnerable to rain that we see coming with this climate change, and we just watch it disintegrate. So if we can plan ahead, we can do these pre-mortem type meetings. Jay and I had talked about forming a special district, so we had the money to actually do these preps, so we don't, so we can take away the dangers that we've already acknowledged exist. I mean, there's a tremendous risk to life and property loss. As we just saw 9 days ago, you know, the water came up to 29,000 CFS at Bull Run, which is tremendous force. And that was in less than 24 hours. Most people in the neighborhood were sleeping while this was going on. They had no idea what was taking place. So I thank you for your attention.
Does anyone have a comment, a clarifying question for Murph before we move on? All right, thank you. These are the issues we'll be bringing back up with the panel. Patty, I'm very happy and glad that you've taken the time to come down here and be here. Patty lives at the Timberline Rim as well, but she's representing the real estate market up there, and you know, it's no small thing to talk about the risk of the river when the river is such a draw for living there, and when you're up there in the summer, it's the tranquility and the views are amazing, and so it does fly in kind of contrast when I think about the mighty Sandy River instead of the way it looks in the summer a lot of the time as this quaint small mountain stream that kind of meanders its way through there. Anyway, thank you very much. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patty Bowie, and I work with Premier Property Group, and I live in Tim Rim. I'm on the board of the HOA and have been living there for about the last 12 years and work with Murph and Don on a lot of the things they're talking about. However, my view is a little bit more emotional and actually financially based when you're dealing with properties up in the mountain. The extending the floodplain zone and including more houses, it's really scary for buyers that come up and they see this wonderful, beautiful environment, and as a broker, we have to disclose anything that might be a material fact for buyers coming in and presenting the really wonderfully drawn, colorful maps and showing that their house is smack dab in the middle of a floodplain, or it could be washed away at any, you know, with the right or the wrong conditions. Property values do fluctuate with, you know, if there are going to be more homes that are brought into this floodplain zone, those properties are going to lose value. And it's, as a homeowner up there and someone who's selling property and helping people buy property up there. That's a scary thing. A home purchase is emotional, it's financial, but we have this wonderful draw, and people come up and they love it. They love the area, they love what Mount Hood has to offer. But once you start talking about floodplains and possible situations where their home could be damaged, or you're looking at it as a financial, uh, something for their financial future, it's scary. I will tell you that having some of the reports and showing what's been done with this group and some of the um, progress, I knew there was a word, the, the progress that's been made is helpful, but the reality is people who aren't informed and don't know may come up and love it, but being told that the house that they love and they want to move into is in a floodplain makes them think. I always recommend flood insurance. My home is not currently in the floodplain, but, well, my husband's a Boy Scout, so we've had flood insurance. uh, but having the information that you guys have put forward and making it available and showing that this is a priority for the group here, that you are looking at the impact to the people who live in the region and in the area, and specifically Timberline Rim, because it comes right through, the Sandy River comes right through our subdivisions. And I don't know, I think being able to put things in a little bit easier to understand, there's some really wonderful words that you guys speak, and being able to put out maybe a paper that speaks in English to people who don't have the backing, the understanding, and that you guys have, and the education that you have would be very useful. I, as a real estate broker, and many of the people up in the mountain, and even people who live there, I think would appreciate seeing the information that you guys have, but smaller words.
Thank you, Patty. No, it's so important that you're here and representing the issues you're talking about, because the perception of risk, it definitely plays a lot into the nature of economic transactions up there, and both property rights and property values. And this happens all over the country when you start talking about hazard mapping, hazard zonation regulations. Even if they're in the best interest of reducing risk, they still have a very emotional tie to how that impacts people. And the points you're making for all of us are very important ones. Thank you. Does anyone have a comment or a question for Patty before we move on? Oh, Steve.
Good morning. You may have covered this before I got here, but the other thing, as Patty, is about houses that are zoned within the floodplain, but what we're talking about is the channel migration zone, which is something physically and geomorphically different, and where the last discussion I heard from the county, there is not a state framework by which you could regulate yet the channel migration zone, even though we know that it exists, even though we've got good maps on it, even though we're in a better place to understand it. So that while the information is useful but intimidating, it's also in this legal limbo where the county's not in a position to declare that it exists, knowing fairly full well now that it does exist. So that's one of these conundrums that the process we're talking about formulating here has to address. How do you regulate something that's not regulatable, or give sub-regulatory information to the community so people can make healthy decisions, but also have some security in terms of their decisions about their livelihood, because the property investments are a big part of people's livelihood.
Yeah. Sure. You can pass the mic right there, Don, and then Murph, but then we'll need to move on.
The question I had was about the erosion zone maps, or flood zone maps either, for that matter. They have an extremely short shelf life. And I'm wondering if they were adopted, how you would address that, because the river modifies itself the moment you turn your back. And so you put out a map that, as you say, puts people in fear of purchasing a home or wanting to sell a home, and then you find out, well, but the river's changed. How can you rely on those maps? And that's what I'm struggling with myself.
That's a good reason why we have the Department of Geology, of Mineral Injuries, and FEMA in the room, because we're just about to embark on adopting the latest set of maps, flood risk maps for the Upper Sandy Basin that have been many years in the work. But, in 2011, overnight, there were probably a half dozen locations in that 10-mile reach where the river was now outside of the mapped FEMA flood zone. And that's the nature, is almost the date you put the time you put a date on it, it's almost obsolete, because sooner or later, probably sooner than later, the river's going to migrate outside of it. And how adaptable, how nimble is the national flood mapping process for rivers that are subject to such dramatic change with such frequency? And I'm going to give it to David first.
So my name is David Rattay with FEMA Region 10, and Jay mentioned the risk map program earlier. And one of the things we can do through the risk map process is create non-regulatory products. So we were talking about the flood insurance rate map and how that applies to floodplain management standards, but we could look at potentially if we can secure additional funding and there's interest with the county and the local stakeholders, different limited approaches for accounting for future conditions. So if through our partners we can identify where there might be changes in the river in the future, we can run a quick model and produce those types of maps that can be used for informed decision making at the local level.
So I'm not sure if Patty can answer this, but it's a premise for my actual question. So one is, in the neighborhood, in the Timberline Rim neighborhood, are there undeveloped lots where houses could still be built? Okay, so in that case, my question is the issues and emotional connection there, does that feel different for places where houses have not yet been built versus places where houses have already been built?
I don't think so, because most of the undeveloped lots actually have homes on either side of them. So if the homes haven't had any detrimental impact from what's happening, and actually we only have very few that are still on the river. I think the majority of the lots that are undeveloped are away from actually being right on the river. But I think when buyers come in and look and they see that there are homes standing with no damage that have been there for 20, 30 years, it's not quite, I mean, it's not any worse than looking at homes that have already been built.
Right, right. And I'll just say too, the public opinion survey that we conducted last year has a question or set of questions that tries to get at the heart of that question about value and future development. And if I remember, one of the statistics was there was a pretty high number of folks who said, I wouldn't want more regulation put on my existing home, but you could or should put more regulation on home or properties that have yet to be developed. And so there's a lot of great statistics, and some of them are a little counterintuitive when you get down into those kind of value questions. Murph.
Well, on that particular subject, I'm an estimator for a local excavation company. And we had just done a dig out for a new home in Timberline Rim, where the ground was nothing but sand, and this is riverfront property. And there's less than 20 feet between the river and the high water mark, I should say, and the foundation of this home. And it's just head shaking that we know what's going to happen during a high water event. The stability of that material that's between the river and that home is extremely unstable. I mean, and it's literally sand. We only hit 2 or 3 rocks in an 8-foot deep dig. I've walked away from jobs that have been upstream outside Timberline Rim that I knew that were in high risk areas, but they were permitted. They passed PERC, and they had an okay to go ahead and build, but they were well within the channel migration zone and the high hazard area. This is so just diligence and knowing what we would be getting into was, no, this property should not be built. We don't want anything to do with it. So it's a
Great.
difficult position to be in.
Thank you for that. We're going to pass it down to Steve so we can keep moving. But we'll have much more time to talk in more detail during the panel. Thank you, Steve. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jay. First of all, I want to echo Don's comments, thanking the county, Jay, the state and federal partners for putting this resilience workshop together. I think it's very important for moving forward for the time that not if, but when the next catastrophe happens. My name is Steve Graper, and I'm here this morning representing numerous groups in the upper Sandy River Basin area, namely the Mount Hood Area Chamber of Commerce, the Rhododendron Community Planning Organization, the Rhododendron Water Association, and the Hoodland Area Water Coalition. And for those that don't know what the Hoodland Area Water Coalition is, from the Ivy Bear on Highway 26 at Alder Creek up to Government Camp, there are over 58 different water systems on the mountain. And the Hoodland Area Water Coalition, or HAWC, is a group of those water systems that comes together to talk about these very issues and issues that are in common to water service providers. Tim Rim is a member of that Hoodland Area Water Coalition group, HAWC group, and it's a very important group. As I'm sure most are aware, the Hoodland area thrives on tourism and recreation dollars. Those dollars are the lifeblood of our area. In addition, most residents in the area either work directly in the tourism trade or indirectly support the recreation tourism industry on the mountain. The businesses that employ those people not only depend on the tourists, travelers, and visitors, they also depend on a reliable workforce to satisfy the needs of those visiting and recreating in the area. My main area of focus this morning is the continuation of commerce in the event when, not if, the next flood emergency happens, and restoring essential services, i.e. water and electricity, to residents and businesses as soon as possible after that emergency occurs. One of the main challenges during the 2011 event that was the fact that many of those who live or work on the mountain were unable to commute to places of employment because transportation routes were blocked, washed out, or unsafe. Businesses could not rely on employees getting to work, and tourists and residents alike could not patronize businesses for the same reason, and commerce suffered as a direct result. While it is understood that disruptions will occur after an emergency and travel may prove difficult, the biggest obstacle, as I see it, is opening and maintaining an authoritative line of communication so that factual information about safe travel routes, detours, repair action plans can be disseminated to the businesses and the residents. As it happened in 2011, all too often, the rumor mill starts up and rumors begin to clog the lines of communication. Those rumors and misinformation could prove dangerous if the wrong information is provided. Businesses need to know factual details of what is being done to restore services and travel routes and when they are expected to be restored so that they can plan accordingly to maintain commerce. From a business perspective, communication is a key. The same goes for essential services such as water and electricity. Emergency services personnel need to work hand in hand with local utility providers in order to help them rapidly restore essential services. A coordinated and planned offensive is necessary so utilities can restore services without danger to themselves or the community and without hindering the efforts to repair or restore transportation routes. From a utility perspective, also, communication is the key. So that is basically my comments, is that in order for commerce to continue, which is the lifeblood of the people that live on the mountain, We need to restore services. I mean, we've been talking about what is taking place to put the stream back in its banks, but when the next catastrophe happens, how do we handle it after the catastrophe and communicate with the residents so that everybody knows what's going on factually and squelch the rumor mill?
Thank you. Thanks for that very powerful delivery from the perspective of the chamber and sharing that with us. Does anyone have a follow-up question or comment for Steve? I mean, we really are interested in the economic viability up there in working with the issues coming out of the Channel Migration Zone hazards, but I think especially thinking about leveraging the next flood disaster as a way to recover in a way that decreases our exposure or vulnerability instead of just falling back into the way we've always been doing things that just continues this cycle of damage, repair, damage, repair. Thank you. Don.
Thank you all for being here and involving us with this. I'll try to be really quick here. One of the things I really want to emphasize is trying to reverse the floodplain development that we've already had, and doing that with buyouts and trades. There's a lot of land that's beautiful up there that homeowners would trade out their riverfront property for some alternative if it was provided. The history that Jay's put together has really informed the locals a lot. So many people have moved up there that have no perspective of the '64 flood and the current events that we're having almost every 2-3 years are just not being documented well, and not being able to communicate to the new people moving in and the tourists that come up there and see it in the nice state and don't understand when it gets wild. And just to put it in perspective, my property line meets the Lolo Pass Bridge on the Sandy River. So I share a property line with Clackamas County. And I have 1,000 feet of river frontage down below the bridge, with Clear Creek entering at that same point. So I have a big confluence of the two rivers right there. In 2001 and 2006, so much sediment moved in front of my house that the riverbed went from its natural state 6 feet higher, with sediment filling the channel. And it took over a year each time for that sediment to move out slowly and get back down to that sort of natural state. So what I see in the sediment movement in the upper basin is a lot of the driver that pushes the river into this migration zone. I was on the upper moraine near the glacier having lunch, spitting cherry pits out, and one cherry pit started a wheelbarrow size slide from just spitting a pit out 20 feet from where I'm sitting. And the way the glaciers are receding, we have so much sediment available in that upper reach that these big water events, on snow or not, are now putting so much material into the river channel that it's migrating tremendously. Jed Roberts did fortunately a great overlay of about 4 years between two LIDAR flyings that were able to do this overlay showing the channel migration and sediment deposit and deposition, and I'm sorry, the other word, erosion and deposition. And these kind of tools are really significant for planning. And I really think we need to see more reversal of the floodplain development with buyouts. And a really good tool is a conservation easement. So property owners can make a commitment in perpetuity that their undeveloped land will not be developed in the future. And the assessor could encourage that by people that participate in those conservation easements to, in the future, keep the remaining intact floodplain and forested areas in a natural state. as opposed to being subdivided and split into future development. And I got a call yesterday from a neighbor who saw the first coho hen wild fish in Little Joe Creek in the Barlow Wayside County Park. So we got to remember that we actively have a recovering river with wild species. The Marmot Dam was removed 10 years ago, and we are seeing recovery of wild fish in the basin that have not seen the opportunities they have in over 100 years. So a lot of good things are happening in the basin, and we can make wise decisions to see that in the future it'll be even better than it is today, but we have to do it wisely.
Thanks, Don. Any comment or follow-up with Don? I appreciate those supporting, considerations around what we're all talking about in a lot of different ways is living with the river rather than, drawing battle lines and perpetually fighting. Mike, let me give you the microphone.
Thanks. This question might be just for the panel to consider, but both Dawn and Dawn, oh, that's okay, spoke about fish. So I'm just thinking in the future for the project, how centered will the fish coming back to the Upper Sandy be played with any kind of mitigation efforts, both of these projects and stuff into the future? So if that could be addressed to the panel, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that quickly before we take a break, but we do have,
Yeah, I would
okay,
real
Don.
quickly. When Clackamas County issues a building permit, at the bottom of that, it says it does not comply or consider ESA or any of those issues. So in the development permit process, those issues aren't taken into consideration.
I did see a coho on Sunday up at the upper jam in the side channel. Don't know which direction he was going, but he was chrome bright. Chrome bright. And that is the first time a fish has been in there since '96.
Thank you.